Good morning, Professor Keel.
Good morning.
You can hear me then. Can you see me?
I can.
Good. Now, in a moment or two, I'm going to invite Mary to ask you to take the oath, but let me first explain the situation, and you can tell us, before I do that, even, what yours is. You're in the offices of your lawyers, are you?
That's right.
And in Edinburgh, is it?
In Edinburgh.
In Edinburgh. And are you on your own at the moment in the room or not?
I am. The technician has just left.
Thank you. You're talking to a small audience here in Aldwych House in London, directly, that is. A slightly greater number of lawyers than there are participants. But beyond this room, you will be talking to a very large number of participants, probably numbering in 3 figures. I imagine quite a few probably in Scotland. They follow on live stream and on YouTube. Now, Mary, please.
Please state your full name.
Aileen Keel.
Take the book in your raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Professor Keel, can you see and hear me?
Yes, I can.
I'm going to start with an overview of your career, which we can take from one of your witness statements. Lawrence, could we have WITN 5736003 on screen, please? We can pick it up at the bottom of the page, Professor Keel, where we can see you describe a number of house officer positions in the late 1970s, and then undertaking work as an honorary registrar in haematology in Edinburgh, August 1979 to July 1981. Just pausing there, is it right then to understand that you qualified as a doctor, a medical doctor, in the 1970s, and you undertook a range of house officer and registrar posts between 1977 and 79?
Indeed, I qualified in 1976 from Glasgow University. There are a couple of earlier posts which are acknowledged further down in the statement that are missing. So I did JHO, Junior House Officer posts, the year after I qualified in the Royal Infirmary in Glasgow and in Dumfries and Galloway Hospital before these SHO posts that are mentioned.
And then we can see you began your haematology training in 1979 and undertook that until 1981. I'll come back to some of these areas in due course. You were then Leukemia Research Fund Fellow at the Royal Hospital for Sick Children in Glasgow between January 1981 and January 1983. Is that right?
Yes.
And again, I'll have some questions in relation to that. You then worked at the Royal Infirmary, Glasgow, as a registrar in haematology between February 1983 and August 1986. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then you moved to London, and you had various posts at senior registrar and consultant level, St Mary's Hospital, Middlesex Hospital, and the Cromwell Hospital and Central Middlesex Hospital in the second half of the 1980s and early 1990s.
Yes.
You then moved to work in government. You worked with the Scottish Home and Health Department, first of all as a senior medical officer, between March 1992 and December 1998. Is that right?
Yes.
You were then Principal Medical Officer, December 1997 to June 1999.
I think it's December 1998.
I'm sorry,
June
yes.
99.
You're right, I'm sorry, my apologies. You were then Deputy Chief Medical Officer between June 1999 and 2014 in Scotland.
Indeed.
And then you were for a year between April 2014 and April 2015 Acting Chief Medical Officer to the Scottish Government.
Yes.
We can take that down, thank you, Lawrence. You, from 1995, were an honorary consultant haematologist with NHS Lothian. What did that entail in broad terms?
It entailed me doing one general haematology clinic a week at Edinburgh Royal Infirmary.
Okay. What in broad terms was the purpose of continuing to do that work whilst working primarily as a medical officer within the Scottish Home and Health Department?
Well, it's interesting. When I joined the department in '92, the idea of doing outside work to keep one's hand in, so to speak, wasn't really thought necessary. But I'd always thought that it would be a good idea for me to maintain a clinical base, particularly given that I was looking after, right from the beginning, blood transfusion, as well as the laboratory specialties, including my own haematology. So I was keen to take up this honorary post with Lothian, and the then CMO agreed, and that's how it came about.
And over what period of time did you do that work? So from 1995 until when?
To 2017.
You were then, having stepped down as Acting Chief Medical Officer, you were from 2015 until recently the Director of the Innovative Healthcare Delivery Programme within the University of Edinburgh. And I think you're now a senior advisor to that programme, but no longer director. What in broad terms is that programme?
Well, it's what it says in the tin, really. It's a programme aiming to make better use, innovative use of the data that's available. So I was seconded out because I had a long-standing ambition, which was shared by many of my senior colleagues, to make better use of cancer data to improve cancer outcomes in Scotland. So IHDP, when it started, had cancer as its focus. And we've done a great deal to bring all the various cancer data sets together in one accessible place so that clinicians, researchers, health service managers can get into the data and look at whatever aspect of cancer they want to examine in a much easier way than was previously available. So most of those data sets either sit within the Scottish Cancer Registry or are closely linked to it. So using modern technology like data virtualization, it's very easy for someone going in to the Cancer Registry to link into other national data sets held by Public Health Scotland. So the aim was to optimise the data which the NHS is awash with to better understand why, for example, cancer outcomes in Scotland are not as good as in the rest of the UK or indeed comparable other countries.
During your time as medical officer, senior principal and deputy CMO, you attended a range of different committees and working parties and groups, either as an observer or participant. We'll come back to some of those in more detail, but is this right? They included the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood, the Advisory Committee on the Microbiological Safety of Blood and Tissue, SNBTS's Medical and Scientific Committee, and the Coagulation Factor Working Party.
Yes.
And you gave written and oral evidence to the Penrose inquiry. Is it correct that your evidence to the Penrose inquiry was confined to the issue of look back?
Indeed.
And does it follow you were not asked to give evidence to the Penrose inquiry on any other issue?
That's correct.
Now, I want to ask you a little more about some of the aspects of your clinical career in haematology. Under which haematologists did you principally train?
Well, in Aberdeen, that would have been Audrey Dawson and Bruce Bennett. In Glasgow, it was George MacDonald, Isabel Walker, and other colleagues. In the sick kids in Glasgow, it was Michael Willoughby. So yes, those are the main people involved in my training.
And if I can ask you just to think back to your work at the Royal Hospital for Sick Children at Yorkhill between January 81 and January 83. What was your work? It's described on your CV and in your statement as Leukemia Research Fund Fellow. What in practice did it entail?
Well, in essence, it was a training program in paediatric haematology, but the main focus of my work was on the cancer side of paediatric haematology. I was looking after children with acute leukemia, with other tumours that occur in childhood. There were, of course, a number of, in the main, boys with bleeding disorders, with haemophilia A and B. I was involved in a peripheral way in looking after them, but actually there was another couple of, I guess they would be described as associate specialists who came in part-time to help Dr. Willoughby manage that side of his practice. So although I think I said in my statement, from time to time, I would prescribe factor VIII concentrates for these boys. In the main, Dr. Willoughby and the other staff members took care of them. I was mainly looking after children with malignancy.
And do you recall what training or instructions or advice you received from Dr. Willoughby or from the other associate specialists you refer to in relation to the treatment of the boys with haemophilia?
Well, I'm afraid at this distance, not really is my answer. I mean, obviously, over the course of my career, I gleaned, of course, my training, I gleaned significant knowledge about bleeding disorders. So I can't really pinpoint what component of that was obtained at Glasgow Sick Kids.
You've said in your statement that you were aware at the time that Dr. Willoughby preferred to use commercial concentrates rather than PFC concentrates. Were you aware at the time of what might be described as the prevailing view amongst other haemophilia directors in Scotland, that the exclusive use of domestic factor VIII was safer than commercial concentrates?
Oh yes, I was, because having come from Aberdeen, where I was involved again in the treatment of haemophilia patients, that was very much the view that one used homegrown products wherever possible. Dr. Willoughby's view was different for, I think, a variety of reasons. One was that I think he felt that the Scottish product was less easy to make up from than the commercial products, and less easy to administer to children. I didn't really have a view, and I don't now, on that aspect. But I think also he felt that supplies of Factor 8 and 9, Scottish Factor 8 and 9, were perhaps not as reliable as he might have wanted. So his backstop was commercial products.
Did you, or do you recall ever having any discussions with him, whether initiated by him or others or by you, about the relative risks of the commercial concentrate versus the domestic concentrate, particularly having regard to the fact that the patient cohort comprised children?
No, I'm afraid I can't remember any such conversations.
And what advice or guidance or instruction were you given as to the information you should provide to patients, or if they were young children, parents, about the risks of the concentrates which you were prescribing or administering?
Well, I mean, I can't remember any specific conversation with Dr. Willoughby about this, but of course, everyone who was working in haematology at that time was aware of the risk of viral transmission by these products. But I should explain that at Yorkhill, I was never seeing patients before they had been treated, patients and their parents. Dr. Willoughby saw all the new patients, and he would have had that conversation with the parents before treatment was initiated. So in fact, my role in managing the haemophilia patients was really very much restricted to prescribing Factor 8 concentrates, which were then administered by the nursing staff.
Now, Dr. Willoughby left Yorkhill, as I understand it, at the end of 1982. Did you have any knowledge of the circumstances of his departure, of why he was moving on?
Other than that he was moving to Australia, no, he didn't discuss his reasons for moving.
And you then left or moved on in January 1983. And took up a post in Glasgow Royal Infirmary. Why did you move from Yorkhill to the Royal Infirmary?
Well, I needed to complete my haematology training, and I'd done 2 years in paediatrics. That was plenty. I needed to get back into adult haematology.
And then in relation to your work at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary 83 to 86, what did that entail in broad terms?
A whole variety of the gamut of haematological conditions. Clearly, I did clinics with consultants and other junior colleagues, covering, general haematological conditions. I was asked by one of those consultants who looked after the leukemia side and the bone marrow transplant side to set up a clinic for myeloma patients, which I ran on my own towards the end of my training. There was a lot of laboratory-based work, reading blood films, bone marrow aspirates, coagulation tests. So the room in which I sat was populated by registrars and senior registrars, all sitting at their microscopes. The labs were along the corridor. We'd be back and forth discussing results with the technical staff. Consultants were nearby. And we also, or I also latterly began to do haemophilia clinics or bleeding clinics with, it was a rather curious arrangement in Glasgow in that the clinicians who looked after the haemophilia patients were not hematologists. They were physicians with an interest in bleeding disorders. You have to remember that hematology is actually a relatively young specialty. It only really developed in the 1960s. So what had happened in Glasgow Royal was that the laboratory-based aspects mainly and the general hematological conditions were looked after by hematologists. Dr. MacDonald, I've already mentioned, being the most senior. And the haemophilia patients were looked after by Professor Charles Forbes and his team. And in the latter part of my training at Glasgow Royal, I think the senior clinicians thought, well, it'd be a good idea if we could deliver more joint training using the haemophilia clinics for the hematology registrars. So I would do I think it was a weekly clinic with mainly Professor Gordon Lowe, so that we were still getting experience of managing haemophilia patients. Now, most of these were very, very long-standing patients, mainly with the problems that arise from bleeding into joints. Many of them were very disabled with arthritic elbows, and knees, and hips, as well as other general medical problems that arise in anybody. So that was the sort of range of hematological areas that I was exposed to in the course of my training at Glasgow Royal. And it was then I sat the exit exam, if you like, for haematology, the membership of the Royal College of Pathologists.
The clinic that you've referred to participating in towards the latter part of your time there, doing the best you can, what year do you think that commenced?
Well, I'm really guessing here. I would think maybe 84.
And understanding that's a guess or an estimate rather than a precise recollection, do you have any recollection of what, if any, information was provided to patients about the risks of transmission of HTLV3?
No, I'm afraid I have no clear recollection. I mean, patients would certainly have been told their results of blood tests, various blood tests in the clinic. But I can't remember anything in the way of written information being provided for them, if that is what you're asking.
The question was a broader one. I appreciate it's a considerable period of time ago, but it's whether you have any recollection of you or Professor Lowe or any others giving information to patients about the possible risks of what might have been referred to then as AIDS or at a point in time HTLV3 from the concentrates with which they were being treated.
I'm afraid I have no clear recollection of any such discussions.
Moving then to your roles in government, how did you come to apply for the role which you took in in 1992. What led you to move into governmental advisory work from full-time clinical work?
Well, in 1991, I had my son, who's now 31, so I was in London with my to-be husband, and we made a collective decision that me coming back to Scotland with Alexander, educating him in Scotland, would be the best move. So I was also keen to move out of full-time clinical work with the on-call commitments that obviously entails. So I began to cast my net wider, and this opportunity came up. I was encouraged to apply for it and got the job.
And encouraged by whom to apply?
Well, the people who were working in Scottish office at that point. Obviously one contacts people to the chat about jobs before one applies, and from what they gleaned about my background, they encouraged me to apply.
Now, you said in your statement that part of your portfolio of responsibilities was responsibility for medical advice in relation to blood and blood products. And was that the case from the beginning in terms of your role as senior medical officer through to the end when you became acting chief medical officer?
Yes.
Were there any other haematologists working within the Scottish Home and Health Department or later the Scottish Executive Health Department?
No.
And what other areas of responsibility did you have, and how did that change over time?
Well, I've already mentioned laboratories, so from very early on, those were the areas that I was looking after. But it didn't take very long for additional things to be added. For example, general medical specialties, which cover the whole gamut of diabetes, respiratory, cardiac, So I had responsibility for those, and later on cancer, and from, I think, certainly the early 2000s, I was chair of the Scottish Cancer Task Force. So apart from surgery, which was looked after by another SMO, and apart from women and children's health, which again were responsibility of others, I covered a wide range of what I call medical issues.
And during the course of the 1990s, roughly how many medical officers, whether senior medical officers or principal medical officers, were there in the Scottish Home and Health Department?
I think I should have done this some. I could have done this some earlier if I'd known the question was going to arise. I think probably about 15 in total. And of course, one area again, which was looked after by suitably qualified PMO and SMO, was that of mental health.
And then post-devolution, so into the 2000s, was it broadly a similar number of medical officers, or was there a significant increase or indeed decrease in the number of medical officers?
Well, there wasn't a significant increase, but my recollection is that round about that time, we were bringing in, I use the term we loosely, and I'll explain why in a minute. Clinicians were being brought in to government on NHS secondment terms rather than being employed as civil servants. So policy leads would often see the benefit of having specific clinical advice in a given area. And they would therefore approach someone working for the NHS, offer them a secondment to come in on a part-time basis, usually, to help out, to give advice. So that the overall number of doctors employed directly by the civil service didn't grow, but the overall cohort of medical advisors to the department did round about that time. And I mentioned in my submission that as DCMO, I held weekly meetings with all of the doctors, or as many as were available on a Monday morning to come along. And I think usually the room had, well, at least 15 people in it. And there'd be others who couldn't attend every week. So those were roughly the numbers.
And in terms of infectious diseases, was that something which fell within your portfolio of responsibilities in the 90s, or was that the responsibility of a different SMO or PMO?
It was not my responsibility, other than in relation, for example, to blood transfusion. I mean, clearly there's an overlap, but no, infectious diseases were dealt with on the public health side of the house. The structure of the department has changed, morphed over many years through different forms. When I joined in 1992, it was split into the management executive under a chief exec from the NHS who'd been appointed from the NHS, which looked after the NHS side of the house and was very much into the operationalisation of health services. And then the other side of the house was the public health division, which was headed up by a career civil servant. And in that bit of the business, infectious diseases of all types would be looked after. And there were it was a PMO and a number of SMOs involved in looking after those areas.
And then in terms of those who had responsibility for policy, in the course of the 1990s, in matters relating to blood products and the issues that were arising in relation to blood and blood products, including issues we'll come on to explore, but look back, financial support, and so on. Who were the civil servants responsible for policy development that you were primarily interacting with?
Probably George Tucker and his bit of the office that I think George was an assistant principal secretary. Can't actually remember the terms, which have changed anyway over the years. But yes, George Tucker and his team were the ones I interacted with most over that period.
And then when we get into the period when you were Deputy Chief Medical Officer, in particular the first decade of this century, who were you primarily interacting with on the policy or administrative civil servant side, again in relation to issues relating to blood products and infected blood?
Well, a whole range of different people, because people came in, moved on, and so that at more junior level, I'm struggling now to remember who during that period was the most senior person. I'm sorry, my memory just
Don't worry,
all that.
we'll look at various documents over the course of your evidence, and if that triggers your memory, please say so, or if overnight any names come to you, please, you can let us know tomorrow. Just to get a sense of your work in the 1990s, is it possible for you to give us a flavour of your average week as a senior medical officer? What kind of activities it might entail?
Well, I always used to say to new recruits that the wonderful thing about working in government is no one day is like another. There was enormous variety. So, are you asking me to look back to the beginning of my career?
Well, just in the 1990s, as a senior medical officer, what might a typical week look like, to the extent that there was one?
Well, loads and loads of paperwork, looking at documents of a variety of kinds, some coming from policy colleagues who were looking for a view on perhaps submissions that they were going to put up to ministers, helping out to answer parliamentary questions which might have cropped up, going out and about, visiting clinicians, going to laboratories, various meetings, for example, with SNBTS, attending committee meetings in Scotland and south of the border, such as ACBSB, supporting ministers as required, attending events that ministers might be speaking at, or meetings with the NHS that ministers were attending. So a very wide range of activities. And as I said, never a dull moment.
And then just picking up on interactions with ministers, again, concentrating on the 1990s first of all, as senior medical officer, principal medical officer, to what extent or with what degree of regularity would you have direct interaction with ministers?
Infrequently would be the word I'd use.
And did that change when you became Deputy Chief Medical Officer?
Yes, and that was exactly at the time of devolution anyway. So things were going to be changing more as a... Well, I would have had more exposure as DCMO anyway, but that combined with devolution gave rise to a very significant change in exposure to ministers after 1999.
You told us that whilst blood products was your responsibility, infectious diseases was the responsibility of other medical officers. Did that demarcation run the risk of insufficient attention being paid to the risks of transmissible disease from blood and blood products when ministers were being advised or when policy was being formulated?
No, I don't recollect that being any barrier to briefing ministers accurately. The meeting that I referred to earlier was with the SMOs, and I instituted was actually in the main to overcome such potential barriers to easy communication, because everybody who attended would share their sort of headline issues with everybody else, and And very often we picked up an overlap that hadn't previously been identified, and whoever the individuals were went away and pushed that out of the meeting. So that was one very visible way where any potential barriers to communication between the public health side of the house and the NHS side, if you can use that phrase, were bridged.
And does it follow from the fact that you said you instituted that arrangement, that in the 1990s, you taking on the role of Deputy Chief Medical Officer, that there was not an equivalent arrangement in place then?
No, I don't mean that. There were different arrangements. When I started in 1992, the way that the medical division was structured was under, I think, 4 principal medical officers who each had a small team of SMOs working to them. And those 4 PMOs met weekly with the CMO and the DCMO on a Monday morning, actually. And they would go into that meeting with the CMO having already met with their team of SMOs. So they were fully briefed on issues that were on our radar screen. They then could brief the DCMO and the CMO. And they would cascade any other information arising in that CMO meeting with us as SMOs. Occasionally, if the PMO wasn't able to attend, an SMO, such as myself, would attend instead at the CMO meeting. So by the late 90s, that PMO structure had begun to change, and there were much less discrete teams, if you like, looking after, for example, mental health, women's health, general medical conditions such as I was looking after. As PMOs retired, they weren't automatically replaced. So it was more of a big team of SMOs. So by the late 90s, the need for a weekly meeting of some sort was obvious, and that's why I instituted it.
Now, how was it determined whether a particular matter or decision needed to be drawn to the attention of ministers?
Well, that decision would, in the vast majority of cases, be for policy leads in a given area and not for the medical team to be deciding.
But did you, from the many years you worked there, and inputting into the formulation of policy, inputting into briefing to ministers, did you get any sense of what the criteria might be for something needing to go to a minister or not, or was it very ad hoc?
I wouldn't say ad hoc. I mean, anything with, and I've said this in my written statement, the potential to impact on individual health or public health would have been drawn to the attention of ministers. It's really impossible to define criteria for that action. But, you know, the issues of the day, the crisis, you know, for example, there's something news this morning, a report from the health committee down south about NHS workforce. You know, that's the kind of thing, of course, the ministers would be briefed on. You know, if there was a perceived problem, issue, with the NHS or indeed with public health, those are the issues that would have merited ministerial briefing.
Can I ask you to look at a document with me? It's ARCH 0003312_020. If we just zoom in on the top half of the page, please, Lawrence. So you'll see, Professor Keel, this is the note of a meeting on the 10th of February 2000 to discuss information required to assist in the examination of circumstances surrounding the safety of SNBTS blood products from hepatitis C. Am I right in understanding that this is part and parcel of the investigation that was commissioned by the Scottish Executive in 1999?
Yes, I imagine it is, yes.
And I'm going to ask you about that at a later stage of your evidence in terms of the detail of the process. But for present purposes, could you just help us understand the relative roles of some of those who are identified as attending this meeting? First of all, we can see a reference there to the Healthcare Policy Division. This is now obviously early 2000. What was the Healthcare Policy Decision? What was its remit and role?
Well, clearly it covered blood transfusion, but I honestly can't remember what else Thea Keel looked after, but that would not be the only area that she was responsible for. You can see down, further down the list, Christine Dora, Healthcare Policy Division, Branch 3. So clearly in Thea Keel's area of responsibility, there were many branches, but I can't really remember, apart from blood transfusion, what they covered.
And do you recall what the role within Branch 3 of that division was of Christine Dora? If we leave aside for the moment her role in relation to the report and the investigation, which we'll come on to, do you recall what her general responsibilities were?
Well, I think Christine at that point, and this is one of the many posts that changed over the years, the individuals occupying that post. She was she was head of branch, the branch that looked after blood transfusion. And Arthur Faulkner was one of her staff.
We can take that down, thank you. When devolution took place, came to fruition in 1999, what, if any, systems were in place to ensure that the Scottish Executive had access to the paperwork and sources of information that had been held by the Scottish Home and Health Department as part of the Scottish office?
Well, all of those files would have been there, and I mean, there was no enormous gear change in 1999 in terms of the office operations. So the files that had been available to Scottish Office were, of course, available to the SE.
And then, in terms of public health more generally, you've referred to in the 1990s the division that you described in broad terms between public health on the one hand and the NHS executive and the organisational NHS matters on the other. Over your time as a medical civil servant, so starting with the 90s coming through into this century, what individuals or entities were particularly responsible for the protection of public health?
You mean the names of the people that were involved in running that side of the house?
Well, it's a slightly broader question than that. So if I break it down into two periods, if we start with the period from 1992 to 1999, would it be right to understand from your earlier evidence that responsibility for public health rested primarily with the division that you've described?
Yes.
And who, as far as you can recall, headed that division?
Well, one senior civil servant, Nicky Munro, did for a long number of years.
And was there, in terms of the roles of deputy chief medical officers and chief medical officer in the 1990s, was there one individual who had any particular responsibility for public health more than any other in those roles?
Well, the CMO always had to cover everything. So, whether it was NHS or public health related, that role covered everything. As far as DCMO is concerned, when I joined, Andrew Young was DCMO, and he covered everything. During the ensuing years, there was a period when there was more than one DCMO, and Andrew Fraser, I can't quite remember when Andrew came into post, but Andrew was public health trained, and he was more focused on the public health side of the house, if you like. And then Peter Donnelly, again, I can't remember when he came in. So there were periods when there were two DCMOs, even during the time that I was DCMO. At the beginning, there was only me, and towards the end of my tenure, there was only me. I understand now there are maybe 3 DCMOs. So it did vary, and depending who, both the Andrew Fraser and Peter Donnelly had public health backgrounds, so naturally their focus was more on that side of the house. But we always worked very, very closely together, particularly in areas that, weren't strictly speaking NHS or public health. There's clearly a great overlap between the two in all sorts of ways, and we may come on to that later when we talk about the CJD, for example.
And were there any bodies or organisations external to the Scottish Home and Health Department, so sticking with the 90s for the moment, that provided advice to government specifically on public health in Scotland?
Well, there's another committee that I attended that isn't actually on the list of committees that you highlighted earlier, and that was the Advisory Committee on Dangerous Pathogens, which was, again, a Department of Health committee. And it kind of illustrates the overlap that I've been trying to describe. I attended because of the blood transfusion and the risk of transmission by that means of pathogens. But round that table, it was mainly, my recollection is that it was mainly individuals from a public health or laboratory background who were around the ACDP table. And indeed, on occasions, my public health Scottish colleague would attend that committee as well for, specific items, or if I couldn't be there. So it was a kind of mixed economy, if you like. But I think that sounds as if it might have been a bit of a guddle. It wasn't. It was really aiming to make sure that all the bases were covered and that communication within the department and between the department and, for example, Department of Health really was as good as it could be, and covering all the issues, not just compartmentalising them into public health or NHS.
Can I ask you to look at your statement again? So WITN 5736003, page 6, please, Lawrence. And it's the paragraph numbered A10, A, B, C, D, and E. If we can just have that a little closer on the screen. Thank you. So you're describing there the role in broad terms of the DCMO and the CMO. I just wanted to ask you something further arising out of the third paragraph there. You say the DCMO and CMO would be involved in advising NHS clinical colleagues on relevant issues through the issuing of CMO letters, which were regarded as authoritative advice from the centre to be implemented by the service. And then you say advice to patients and or the general public was largely the responsibility of health boards. Now, if we leave aside the question of individual advice to patients, put that to one side, you suggest there that advice to the general public was largely the responsibility of health boards. Was advice to the general public therefore not regarded as the responsibility of the DCMO and CMO?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think this paragraph really relates to the vehicles by which advice was got out to the general public. And in the main, that was not directly from the CMO or DCMO. Very often the CMO letters that I've referred to, for example, would be asking the directors of public health to further cascade that advice through their boards and maybe to the general public. The CMO letters, of course, were by no means the main vehicle by which the department communicated with the NHS. There were health department letters, which later became chief executive letters, and they were much more frequent than the issuing of CMO letters.
And then, in relation to the CMO letters themselves, do you recall there ever being a reticence on the part of DCMOs or CMOs in Scotland to issue such Dear Doctor or Dear Director of Public Health letters on the basis it might be seen as an interference with the clinical freedom of medical practitioners?
Well, I think that was always, we were always conscious of that because individual clinicians are responsible for their patients and whatever decisions they make around their management, and it would not be appropriate for a CMO or a DCMO to be getting down to that level of detail. So, yes, the advice would be, well, the content of the CMO letters would certainly take that into account.
We can take that down, thank you. Can I turn then to ask you a little about the relationship with the Department of Health in London? And I want to divide this into pre-devolution and post-devolution periods. So starting with the 1990s, essentially up to 1999. What measures were in place to try and ensure coordination or consistency of medical advice as between the Scottish Home and Health Department medical officers and the Department of Health medical officers?
Well, obviously there were the official committees that were run out of Department of Health, but it was absolutely recognised by all the SMOs, by all the doctors in, I think, both departments, that that did not go far enough in terms of ensuring timely communication. So we all built our own mini networks, if you like. In my case, if I can talk about the committees I was involved in, with the Secretariat of ACVSB and later MSBT, you know, one would really try and get to know those individuals through the meetings, through telephone conversations, so that one could be sure of being alerted to information that was emerging or whatever well in advance, so that in turn I could be ready to provide briefing for our ministers.
And was
So
I'm
we
sorry.
all built our own networks.
And was there an objective to try and ensure consistency of medical advice? That whatever was being advised by the medical officers in the Department of Health in London, you would want to be saying similar things in Scotland, or was that not part of any objective?
Well, I think consistency of clinical advice is very important. But if you mean by that, were we, you know, in Scotland trying to accommodate to English views? No. I mean, I can't remember any occasions when there was any disagreement between me and my counterparts in Department of Health around the clinical advice that was being offered. You know, there was consensus, and if there were any minor disagreements, we had conversations and ironed them out, so that the advice going to ministers north and south of the border, from a clinical point of view, was consistent. That was very important.
What's your impression of the freedom that the Scottish Home and Health Department had in the 1990s to take steps in relation to blood or blood products or infected blod that was different from what was being done by the Department of Health in England?
Well, since 1948, the Scottish NHS has always been a very distinct entity, and very different in structure from down south, and often in operational delivery. So I never felt in the 90s pre-devolution that there was really any inhibition of Scotland making its own decisions in relation to health and health policy. And I suppose a good example of that would be the HCV look back, which took place in the mid-90s. In the early 90s, before I came into government, there had been a lot of discussion clearly around whether an HCV look back would be feasible or not. And the general view was that it wouldn't be, and therefore that it would not be, a look back would never be undertaken. That began to change in the early 90s with the work in South East Scotland. It was laterally called a pilot study, led by Jack Gillan, who demonstrated by 1994 that it was indeed feasible to conduct a look-back exercise. Not easy, not at all easy, but feasible. Now, at that point, the view south of the border was still resistant, if you like, to the idea of conducting a look back. But through what happened in Scotland, we were able to persuade Department of Health colleagues and indeed ministers that a look back should go ahead. So that's one example of Scotland, if you like, kind of leading the way and ultimately ending up with a UK-wide hepatitis C look-back exercise.
I'll come on to ask you in due course some more about the look back. Just sticking then with the relationship between Health Department in Scotland and the Department of Health in London, how did that relationship change post-devolution?
My impression was that we needed to work even harder in Scotland to make sure that communications were good with Department of Health. There was the potential danger of England thinking, well, they've got devolution now, they'll be looking after their own health-related issues, the need for our input will be less, but clearly that was not the case. So I think I certainly felt that I needed to reinforce the links that I had through the various committees and ensure that the Scottish voice was still heard and that they would let us know of developments that were taking place.
Can I ask you just a little next about your relationship as a medical officer with SNBTS, the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service? You've told us in your statement that you would regularly attend meetings of the SNBTS Medical and Scientific Committee. What was the purpose of your attendance at those meetings?
Well, to act as a conduit for any important blood transfusion-related issues back into government.
You also describe having various ad hoc meetings with those at SNBTS. To what extent did you have regular interaction with Professor Cash?
Well, the MSc meetings that you've referred to, obviously saw him there. In terms of how frequently I met him, I don't know, maybe half a dozen times a year.
And then could we look at an example of another type of meeting with SNBTS? Lawrence, could we have SCGV 000095_035, please? And if we just look at the top part of the page, thank you. So this is described as a note of an SNBTS general issues meeting. This particular meeting is the 24th of November 2000. We've had plenty of examples of other general issues meetings in the material that you've been supplied with. What was the purpose of these general issues meetings? What did they encompass?
Well, I suppose, as the name implies, anything that was an issue of interest. I mean, blood transfusion, particularly during the 80s and 90s, was a field of great activity, discovery of new viruses that could be transmitted by blood, such as HIV, hepatitis C, the issue of the CJD later on. So there were always things to be discussed, hammered out with SNBTS. So this was a general catch-all meeting, if you like, that we felt was very valuable in the department keeping close to the kind of issues I've mentioned.
We can take that down, thank you. What about relationships with haemophilia centre directors? First of all, the UKHCDO. What was the extent of your dealings with and interactions with UKHCDO in the 90s and beyond?
I had very limited direct dealings with UKHCDO. I certainly didn't attend any of their meetings. I think there's a letter in the papers from me at one point to Brian Colvin, who was then the chair of HCDO, around hepatitis C or haemophiliacs who'd potentially been exposed to hepatitis C. But no, very few direct dealings with UKHCDO.
And then in terms of dealings with haemophilia centre directors in Scotland, if we can look at another example of a meeting, LOTH 000051_067, please, Lawrence. Again, we can look at the top half of the page. So we can see this is the Coagulation Factor Working Party, and this is a meeting on the 1st of May 1992. We can see that you were in attendance, and under the heading Apologies and Introduction, we can see from the second paragraph it says Dr. Ludlam welcomed the group, and in particular Dr. Keel in her role as SOHHD representative. Why was it thought necessary to have a representative of the Scottish Home and Health Department at the meetings of the Coagulation Factor Working Party?
Well, I can't answer that very directly because I wasn't in the genesis of the Coagulation Factor Working Party. But I imagine that it was thought it would be helpful to have someone there from government, again, to act as a conduit for any information or any issues that had been discussed in this meeting back into government. And as I've already said, I mean, there were what might be described as hot topics in the area of blood transfusion. I mean, the AIDS virus had been discovered in the mid-80s, and clearly haemophilia directors have been very exercised about the potential for transmission of that virus and others in coagulation factors. So it was a hot topic, and I imagine that they thought someone from Scottish office round the table could be helpful.
And do you have any recollection of the frequency with which the Coagulation Factor Working Party met? The documents I've seen suggest that there may have been several meetings in the course of a year.
Hazy recollection, I think maybe 4 a year.
And so throughout the 1990s, you would have regular interaction then with the Scottish Haemophilia Centre directors through this route?
Yes.
And was there any other forum or working party or committee or anything of that kind which provided another means for regular interaction with the Scottish Haemophilia Centre directors, or was this the route for that?
This was the route.
If we just look at LOTH 5082_009, I think it's right to say that there may also have been an annual meeting. This is described as the minutes of the annual meeting of the Scotland and Northern Ireland Haemophilia Directors, SNBTS Directors and Scottish Executive Health Department. And we've certainly heard evidence, Professor Keel, from other witnesses dealing with earlier time periods, that there was a system of annual meetings bringing together the Haemophilia Centre Directors, SNBTS, and the Scottish Home and Health Department, or by now the Scottish Executive Health Department. We can see you're in attendance. As far as you can recall, did you generally attend these annual meetings as a representative of the Scottish Health Department?
Yes, I did. I mean, these were, if you like, kind of a set piece annually, and the haemophilia directors were always very keen that the CMO of the day chaired this annual meeting. And you're right, it brought together the haemophilia directors with SNBTS and government. But it was by no means a way of gleaning intelligence throughout the course of the year. It was a bringing together of issues that had been discussed, for example, in the coagulation factor working party.
We can take that down, thank you. Can I then just ask you, I note the time, so I'm sorry, we're trespassing into the morning break. I'll pick it up after the break, if we could take the break now.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now until 11:45. Now, this is the first break in what will be a number of breaks in your evidence. You're under oath. What you must not do is discuss with anyone, whoever that anyone is, the evidence you have given or any evidence which you think you may yet be asked to give. But you can talk about anything else you like.
Thank you.
11:45.